Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Wrestling for Life Network. We are live again, as always. And this time we got something to dive into. It's going to be a fun one as we are going to review episode 1, 2, and 3 of the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary. Everybody's talking about it. Everyone's a buzz. Me and that pretty face going to go through all of it here. So get in that chat, click some buttons, say hello. And don't forget, we are back tonight for part 2. It's going to be a fun one, folks. Let's go. Ding, ding, ding. We are live and back at it again, folks. Like I said, today is a bit of a special stream for the almost 60 people already here on a 2:30 on a Thursday. Hello, hello, hello. Hope everyone is doing well. Friday Junior clicking along. And as I mentioned, we will be back tonight at 8 p.m. to cover a little more of this documentary. But the IWC has been ablaze over the last 24 hours talking about the Mr. McMahon doc and the 6-part series. Nick and I have plugged most of our way through it. I think I got through it, but lots to talk about, lots to get into with this one. So we're going to give you our 2 cents, our take, and break it all down. If you don't know, I am Mr. Every Night KJ White, the Iron Man of YouTube. That is Big Nick.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I don't know if this feels appropriate with this one. Yes, that is the Every Night Delight KJ White. I am Big Nick. And yeah, I'm at time of everything with this going on. I'm through episode 4. I went through that one, so I've got the last 2 to still go through and everything.
There you go.
But yeah, this was a lot of people, like the second that this was gonna drop, they were lining up Christ Mercedes Monet's like, I'm gonna get a glass of wine and watch some Netflix.
Don't get me started on that, lady. But yeah, no, I definitely wrestlers were talking about it, fans were talking about it. Vince put out a preempted strike on it. Other people have come out and commented on it. Janelle Grant's attorney has since put out a statement on her behalf about it. Very interesting. Very, very interesting how this is all playing out. I do believe, and I guess what we'll do is kind of give us your overall thoughts so far in the first 3 episodes. I mean, nothing groundbreaking out of the first 3 episodes, Nick. Very, I mean, if you are not like a super nerd like us, that maybe you were going to get a good history lesson. Like, it's not a bad little book report on the how WWE came to be and some of the things they went through in the early days. But I feel like it was marketed as like this big salacious story. We're going to dive into who is Vince McMahon, and a lot of this felt like, who is the WWE?
Well, that was kind of, I think initially was supposed to be kind of just the McMahon, like you said, a book report on Mr. McMahon, and really kind of just a history of WWE. Now, they even mentioned towards the beginning of it of certain things might have changed the perspective and changed the narrative on this and everything. And I think that's really what with a lot of people, we got caught up of, well, everything else is going on with Vince, so this is going to be sensational. This is going to be, we had Conrad saying it's going to be a 2-shovel burial. And it really, especially the first 3, was just WWE history. I mean, granted, if you don't watch, if you're not a wrestling nerd or anything like that, like it's still on Netflix and you've got McMahon in the headlines and everything, so non-wrestling fans are going to click on it. But it explains everything pretty much leading up to, especially in the first 3, to about Mr. McMahon. So like you said, it's a book report on Vince McMahon.
Yeah, I mean, again, nice history for those who didn't know, as far as, him growing up poor and being I've kind of gone through his the book that came out about him, so you have that idea that he didn't know his father. He wasn't born into wealth that people think he was, born in trailer park, and from at least his report, nothing really substantiated, but he definitely had a rough upbringing, abusive rumors or innuendo kind of pointing towards maybe sexual-ish abuse as well. So, I mean, again, it's very vague. It's very, like, he's almost a mystery. Even through, like, he met Linda when he was 16, so that was interesting. But, yeah, I mean, again, it didn't really carve into Like, I kind of wanted some interviews with like people we don't normally see. Like, we know what Bruce thinks of Vince, we know what Meltzer thinks of Vince. So, I mean, I found from that standpoint, it was just maybe a little oversold, or maybe the fan base kind of had a different anticipation of it. But yeah, we'll figure that out.
Well, and I also, you kind of have to have those friends in order for those friends to show up and be interviewed and everything,
True.
because it was still interesting of, Vince didn't, meet his actual father until he was 12. Like you said, he didn't meet Linda until he was 16 and all of that. And Vince did a whole lot. There was multiple times throughout watching this to where he like leans towards he'd rather just put on a facade than let anybody in. Like he'll mention like it's easier to act than be the real you and
Yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. Quickly, we'll say hello to Roman, Mike, Daniel. I see Dale. Scott was disappointed. Today is my wrestling day. I go to wrestling show later today. Dale, have fun. Remember, if you bring a Wrestling for Life sign and you can prove it, we may send you a t-shirt. How's everyone? Good to see you, Damien. Mike, we got you. Trey, welcome. So everybody on a Thursday afternoon hanging out with us, I do appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, a couple other notes I made just on the overall before we get into the individual episodes. I do want to caution fans out there who do follow wrestling dirt sheets and reporters on the internet. I found a lot over the last 24 hours of like people just taking quotes out of it. Like it was some groundbreaking stuff. Like once a time, like, Vince did this. We're like, we kind of know that. Like, Stone Cold doesn't believe in CTE. Like, we're like, all right. Like a lot of shit is getting pawned off for clicks, and not a lot of it is anything substantial. Like it's literally a hope that you'll click on their link, and it's nothing. It's frivolous. It's empty.
I mean, I don't know. I think we can talk about the Stone Cold talking about CTE and everything later tonight and all of that.
Yeah, we'll save
Yeah,
that.
that's a little bit of a tease, but I will say with this, there is at times a lot of other people in this documentary put their foot in their mouths and everything. Like
A little bit.
Hogan, a good bit. I know
Well,
he's known for obviously
Yeah.
extending the truth, falsifying the truth, what have you. But
Yeah.
yeah, not everybody else comes out of this looking squeaky clean as well.
No, not at all. And again, I think there was. I just felt like it would. Like, so I see Trekpedia here, Trekupedia. People have told me it reminds them of the documentary Dark Side of the Ring. Guys did where it was just stitched together clips of Dark Side of the Ring episodes. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that at least Dark Side went into it. Like, what was the seedy stuff? Like, a lot of it is like he was accused of this, moving on. Like, he was accused of that, moving on. Like, there wasn't a real in-depth breakdown of these salacious things. So, I mean, again, that's a very interesting take, but I did kind of expect I mean a little more, as far as this was marketed or built.
Well, that's I think, and that's really the crux of this is how it was marketed, and especially like with everything that's come out recently with Vince. This was initially just going to be essentially a book report on Vince. This was going to be the history of this. This was him sending off into that sweet good night and everything. He had washed his hands of being in the business, and it was going to be a anthology, a history. But then news broke, rumors broke, NDAs popped out, and that's where you expected this to be more salacious.
Yeah, and did you find it like I found it a little bit interesting, and I think because of how things broke, I thought they could have done a better job of circling back, like, and maybe people avoided them because a lot of the interviews were 2021, 2022. So, right. I mean, I saw a couple people like making comments about the Undertaker, like, of course the Undertaker loves Vince, so you wouldn't say anything bad about him. Like, he said that in 2022. This is 2 years later. Maybe if you sat down with Mark now, he'd still say, yeah, he's like a father figure, but maybe not as fondly as he once did. Like, well, it's really the context becomes king in this one.
A bit, and is something that you do have to take into account with this, is these are interviews that are sat on. These are candid interviews and everything. Like there's the one to where it was Steph and they're talking about like bringing in Mike Tyson, and then it cuts from like present day to like clearly something from like the late 90s, early 2000s of them interviewing Steph, and they're like spliced together. So there is timing is a big thing with this too.
Right. The last thing I was going to say about this before we get into episode 1, it kind of made me chuckle that, you know, it came out like I saw one and it specifically said AEW legend says Vince McMahon Doc hurts AEW's ratings or is trying to hurt AEW's ratings. And I'm like, let's get real, people. If your show, again, if you want to see something, you'll see it. Like, people wanted to see this, so they went and saw it. Like, if you're losing fans to a documentary about an old guy that apparently all your fans hate, it's a stretch.
But we've brought this up before. There was already the whole talks of Dave, which Dave is a prominent feature in this documentary.
Really is.
By the way,
Which I hate.
he's a crux somehow, some way with this. But
well,
there was Meltzer. Sorry, I'll just say real quick. There was Meltzer already saying the WNBA playoffs were going to affect Dynamite's ratings. So of course, I even thought with them putting it out on Wednesday was almost a strategic play of. People are going to be paying attention and going to be talking about this, and you're going to get less of a buzz about Grand Slam.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And I like this comment real quick about this is why we'll never get a truthful memoir book. Maybe on his deathbed, he opens up and just kind of spills all the beans, but until then, he's not. And again, I think we all believe, and just to be clear before we do review this, Nick and I have been very vocal about our criticisms of this person. He almost destroyed my love for wrestling, made me quit watching it. And then beyond that, we do believe that there's a lot of smoke, which means there's probably some good amount of fire that, took place. Way too many payouts, way too many buyouts. You don't do that if you're innocent of everything. So we're not letting him off the hook by any means. I just feel like this didn't give us a little more to dig into.
Well, and I'll say this, I think this was in the 3rd episode where they're talking about the steroid trial and everything, and I will give Meltzer a half bit of credit with this because it was a good quote of where he's talking about how Vince, may have not exactly been guilty of what they were accusing him of doing, but he's still a bad guy. He's still a bad guy.
Still guilty of a lot of things, and I found it, and again, we'll talk more about that part tonight, so without belaboring the point or going too far into kind of the overall sentiment. Episode 1 talked about him growing up in a trailer park, interesting relationship with his dad. I guess his stepdad was highly abusive, according to Vince. Like, he was getting his ass kicked all the time and made him tough. One thing I took out of this, and I made the note of, imagine if Gorilla Monsoon had bought the WWF at that time when Vince made the push.
Yeah, that was crazy. I didn't know about the whole Gorilla thing and everything of that. Being a potential option. My brain just kind of went into that what if scenario.
Yeah, could you imagine like how different wrestling? I mean, we might still have territories to this day.
Yeah, wrestling history would forever change.
Yeah, I mean, that's crazy. And Vince was very savvy about it. He doesn't meet his father till he's past the late in his teens, and even then it's a really kind of cold relationship with his dad. But once he makes that proposition to his father about like, here, I'll make 3 payments. If I miss a payment, you can have my money and we'll go away. And Linda seems to be a very calm head in the whole situation of like, yeah, we were basically taking money out of the one end of the company and putting it back into the other side. So we were robbing Peter to pay Paul, I believe, as she put it. Right.
Well, and it shows, being, a businessman above all else really runs, I guess, in Vince's DNA. I did also want to bring up, because I actually even timed it out, of like 5 minutes into the documentary is when they mention about the accusations. They get that really boom right in the front of that, and even have the cutaway to where Vince's last interview is pulled away because of breaking news and all of that. So it's that interesting juxtaposition. You go from most recent stuff to we're going all the way back to Vince in a trailer park.
Yeah. And again, Netflix being Netflix, smart enough to know, like, well, we'll tease where this is heading, even if it's not really where it's heading, but we're going to give you a reason to stick around.
Oh, yeah.
So, we did get Uncle Dave, as we mentioned. I don't like his face. I'm sorry, but at least his room is clean. He tidied up for Netflix. That was pretty good. Sorry, Uncle Dave. I just don't like your face.
What set did they have him in? And I kept thinking he almost had like the New Jack forehead for whatever reason. And everything. Man, it looked like he took 1,000 blade jobs.
But I mean, again, then it quickly kind of transitions from like, now Vince has control. His dad wouldn't listen to him. He found a way to buy the company out, swooped it under from Gorilla. Gorilla ends up working for him, as we know, for years. But then kind of just starts picking away at the territories, one after the other, just starts buying up all their top guys. Or if you were a draw, Vince McMahon was going to pull you in, which ends up being ironic because of what happened with WCW and AEW.
Right. And I like that they even tie that in at the end and everything. Do you think that this leaned into Vince having issues with like finding his dad later on and everything like that, and getting involved and having to buy the business from him instead of it being passed on to him, instead of, he was almost going to sell it to Gorilla?
Yep.
Do you think that really kind of messed with him?
I think so. I think, I mean, not knowing his dad, I think part of it, and I think they said it in the actual documentary near the end, is the idea that because he came out of that poor upbringing, he hated it. Like, that's partly why he's kind of got that attitude that he has of like, I self-made myself, even though there's a little bit, like, as true as that might be, there is a little bit of like, yeah, your dad was still a pretty prominent guy and you weren't exactly homeless, you figured it out. But I think he always looked down upon the that lifestyle, didn't wanted to run from it. And then I think it ties into what we'll see later with Shane, right? Like, that kind of business approach to his child.
Right. Yeah, 100% of he was so turned off and turned away from it that he proceeded to want to be the antithesis of it.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I think that's what he ends up portraying very well, of the larger than life, the absolute example of a shrewd businessman. And that's
he almost became the definition of it, honestly, of really, pay, like you even mentioned with Linda, robbing Peter to pay Paul, of he kind of became the stereotype of what that personality, what that character looks like.
Yeah. Especially with how he, like, and that's where they were with this in the episode 1, especially with, like I said, like he said, all I cared about was me. I didn't care who was mad at me. And I had heard other stories and listening to other podcasters previously about, like, people wanted to bury Vince. Like, they were calling Vince Sr. and like, you better talk to your kid. Like, we're gonna mash this kid up if we get our hands on him.
It's such a dark day, and it's the history. It's to where literally multiple upon multiple companies and families and everything were just shut down. Like, it's, what was it, Black Tuesday, to where Vince shows up and he's on national broadcast of every territory out there. So 100%, that's, I at least like that this was painting the history of everything with wrestling.
Yeah, kind of the origin story. One thing that I thought was really interesting in the first episode, and they talked about it early on, I think Linda said it first, and then a couple other people echoed it, but was very much, and this is kind of why I think it was such a big deal, like in the 80s into the 90s, was wrestling's always kind of mimicked society. Art always imitated life. So they talked a lot about, that's where Hulk Hogan became such a big deal, because, the all-American baby face against the evil intruders. And they talked about it was the Germans and the Japanese, and then it was, the Iraqis or the, Iranis. Like, they kind of literally, what was happening in the world became, what they wanted to present. And they wanted that out on stage. Very Shakespearean.
100%. Well, even it gets into more episode 2, and we might have a thing or two still to say about episode 1. But when they get into episode 2, they start talking about the rock and wrestling and that whole connection, and to where Vince was a forebearer and a front runner on tying in celebrities and bringing in that pop culture, and like you said, of art imitating life and vice versa, of being aware of the pop culture sphere going on, being aware of what else is going on and how can I tie this in.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, again, they go into like the Andre Hogan stuff, which, for those who didn't know, Hogan wasn't always perceived as the mess that he is now. Again, whether we love him or hate him, he was a pivotal part of everything that happened. And then when they were finally able to build that, what I did find, I think the most interesting part of all of the episode 1, it was one of the only times in the entire series where Vince actually seemed emotional or a little vulnerable was discussing his dad. And my dad was proud of me. And even at his age, it was one of the only things where he seemed to soften a little. There was almost like a tear in his eye of like, I made my dad proud on that day. Like, that was a very interesting take because he's such a hard nut, right?
Well, and that's why I think that the whole Vince has daddy issues. Let's just call it what it is. I think it's very much something like that to where this man's still in his 70s and 80s at this point and is getting teary-eyed and misty-eyed because I made my dad proud that day. Like, that meant so much to him and everything. And that the facade slipped a little bit there and everything. He wasn't Mr. McMahon anymore. That was Vince.
Yeah. And I mean, I found it interesting near the end of the episode. They kind of started touching on some of the controversies that happened, but even though they were kind of like, they've almost become folklore at this point. I mean, Dave Schultz slapping out John Stutzel still to this day is a classic.
Do you think Vince sent that up?
I think that Tony Atlas probably gave the best rendition of what actually happened, in the sense of he might not have said do it, but he was like, I wish a motherfucker would.
Right, yeah. Tony Atlas is an MVP of this whole documentary, and so is Brett. I have it written down of Brett's quote of "I was a true artist." Like, what the Brett, you'd be out there with the chapeau, painting a masterpiece, painting the bowl of fruit.
What I thought was funny was when Vince said, well, Brett lacked charisma, which, I mean, he kind of did. Like, I mean, he wasn't the most going guy. Took it super serious, took everything super serious. But near the end as they end episode 1, they start talking about like WrestleMania is a huge success. With success comes scrutiny, and that's when some of the other scandals start, as far as the steroids and that. But episode 2 kind of gets into the Saturday Night Main Event, the overworking the talent, and they kind of portrayed it as like this harsh dictator making it. But that was the wrestling business in general. Like, it wasn't just Vince running the talent that hard.
Yeah, it was just he at that point was the only guy doing it, because if you go back to the territory days and everything, 100%, it was still similar dates. It was still similar times and everything. It's Vince was just at that point really the only big game in town.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, again, we've talked to, and still to this day, they talked about, I mean, guaranteed contracts changed the world for a lot of reasons, but the idea that, at that time, if you didn't show up, you didn't get paid. So that led to a lot of the problems that then end up transpiring. One of my favorite things in episode 2, Nick, is just, again, typical Hogan. And then another long-standing wrestling story is, Jesse Ventura tries to rally the troops for a union, and Hogan's like, that doesn't work for me, brother. Don't fuck up my deal.
But to be so open about being a snitch, my guy. Like, to just blatantly be a snitch. And again, Tony Atlas, the MVP of like 100%, he went and did that. Like, for Hogan to be so blatant about like, yeah, I went and told Vince that he shouldn't have done that and everything, and this is what's going on. Like, and Tony, 100%, Terry, you keep putting your foot in your mouth here.
Yeah, and what pissed people off so much was, it was easy for Hogan to say don't do it because he was the golden boy. He was making all the money. He wasn't hurting. He wasn't having to work as many dates as the other guys. Like, he was so protected that the idea that they might ruin something or like make a stand, Hogan proves that it's Hogan, right? Like, it's all about me. And Terry's like, no, brother, I'm going to Vince.
I ended up thinking this, and like I said, I'm still currently, as of time of recording, what have you, through episode 4, Hogan and Vince in this whole thing very much come off like Tom Brady and Bill Belichick throughout this whole type of thing, of that very much of, we might disagree, but I will always have that man's back type of situation, what have you, like, and still that who, was the one that really built the thing. Because
that's a really good way to put it. And I mean, I think I imagine, like, to this day, like, Vince and Hogan, like, exchanging phone calls, like, how's it going, brother? How you doing? Like, they're forever intertwined. And they both, like you said, that Tom Brady, Belichick, like, it was me. No, it was you. And like, even when it came to the NWO stuff, which they get into, it made me laugh, right? Of like the two egos kind of killed me. Where did episode go? Episode 2 went into WrestleMania 2 and 3, where they did 2 cities, or no, they did it through 3 cities. It was a flop. It didn't go well. It was a mess. So some issues there. Still kind of talking about more of the history of WWE and their programming and what they were doing. One of my favorite parts is the Pontiac Superdome. 93,000, 93,000, 93,000, 78,000.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is that's part of my whole notes is did Mania 3 do 93,000? And then the next note beneath it is Meltzer hates Mania 3.
Meltzer is
like, you even have like again the most unreliable witness in this whole thing. Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan up there of we did 93,183 or whatever number he's at there and threw out like down to the person and everything.
Yeah. No, that made me laugh. I really do think that they, you know, I guess it kind of matters in the lore, but in the record books it says 93,000. So we all just assume. But I thought maybe that was an opportunity for them to kind of like interview somebody that worked at the city or worked at the arena or track down some facts and figures. Like it's got to be public record somewhere.
Yeah, but that's not the crux of this. That's the thing is we all want to know the answer. Was it really 93? We're all out there like Meltzer. I think it was like 73,000, what have you. But at the end of the day, WrestleMania 3 was a success, rebounded off of WrestleMania 2 and really, you know, springboarded WWE into the limelight, into the prominent, like we were talking about with the rock and roll wrestling going on, to where you had Cyndi Lauper showing up, you had Mr. T involved, you had again all these celebrities involved.
And being like as they get to like 87, 88, I'm like 4 or 5 years old at this point. And I mean, as a kid, you're seeing like Mr. T was a huge star, MTV's just breaking out. And there's all these wrestlers, like they're all involved with wrestlers, and it was a really cool time. I mean, I had all the big rubber wrestlers that you could beat the shit out of your brother with. They were phenomenal.
Oh, I don't know if it's now or if it's later to where they're even showing like, you remember where they had like the stuffed up like wrestlers like of Hulk Hogan, everything, the Wrestle Buddies and everything. I 100% that was. In my head, I was growing up and I was wrestling Hulk Hogan on my trampoline and everything like that, doing all the moves and everything. I 100% was, you know, Hulkamania and everything was running wild, brother.
Right. They kind of jumped to, well, they talked about another interesting Hogan story is Hogan wants to do movies because Hogan thinks he's great. So No Holds Bar, which I saw when I was a young kid, and I thought it was cool. But yeah, they make a shitty movie that flops, but you know, in an attempt to keep Hogan within the company. So we can thank Hogan for all the great WWE studio films.
Straight to DVD movies and everything.
Right.
But yeah, this is also, though, too, where they start to get into the other scandals and everything. Like this is where Phil Mushnick gets very much involved into this documentary and has brought up how much he hates Vince.
Yeah, did Vince like shag his mom? Like what did like his mom get beat up by a wrestler? What is Phil's? I want to know more about Phil. What is Phil's motivation? Because he hates it.
I asked towards the end, I was like, does he just hate wrestling? Because at this point, you just feel he hates Vince because they cut to Vince in an interview and then it cuts to Phil and he's just like, because he's a scumbag.
Yeah, it just feels so personal for Phil. And I just don't quite understand. Like, I get you're an investigative journalist, blah, blah, blah. But it just like with all the shit, like, why did he focus so many years on trying to bury Vince? There has to be a connection.
Well, and it to me, it almost feels, and then I forgot about this in episode 1, but they mentioned this is when you get a good bit of Phil Costas too and everything like that, who had the infamous interview with Vince. And he's still kind of a dick towards Vince and everything and towards pro wrestling as a whole. I think it's just, you get some people that have that still negative view of it's pro wrestling, it's beneath me. What's granted, he did still shine a light on a lot of other issues that were going on that most people didn't know about. Like they talk about the Jimmy Snuka situation. They talk about the ring boy situation with Pat Patterson and all of that. So this is where you start to get into the controversies going around in pro wrestling.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I was looking for, again, a little bit more of like, Okay, 3 people get named, and I think I'm skipping ahead a little because they do get into the steroids. Dr. Zaharian gets himself.
This is the start of them talking about all the
Yeah.
controversies. Like this is again to where Tony Atlas, and I'm quoting this man, has some famous quotes of "We abuse the hell out of women," and then it also follows it up with "Pat Patterson grabbed my pecker." So again, Tony Atlas
I don't mean to
is
laugh
the
at
star of this goddamn documentary, but yeah,
that.
they don't hold anything back when it
Yeah.
comes to really talking about some of that stuff.
Well, the producer says to Tony, like, why didn't you tell someone? He's like, but Tony was a huge dude. If he really wanted to not, like, I mean, it just seems so weird that, like, Pat, like, I mean, I watched the Pat Patterson documentary, and I mean, the guy didn't really, like, I don't know. It just seems so weird.
Well, and it made sense. Well, it in his even head of he instantly goes to, you don't understand the wrestling business. He's the
Yeah.
booker, and then he's the second in control, and that's where this whole power system and why Vince is viewed the way Vince is viewed at times and everything, because you were in that position of power with all of this stuff going on.
Yeah, and I think it was Bruce that was like, 2 of them were guilty, Pat's not. And he just said no comment when the producer kind of pushed. Like, he was like, Pat was a good guy. Pat got pegged because of Pat's sexuality, but the other 2 were bad. And I like the Ring Boy scandal was crazy. And I mean, again, as a young wrestling fan, we had no idea that any of that was happening.
This is 100%. And this is really, I'll say this. It was someone mentioned it towards like Dark Side of the Ring and everything earlier. Every episode of this could have been a season of a Dark Side of the Ring and everything. There's so much with this, like even just with this whole scandal and everything, could have been a whole episode on its own. Could have 100% delved into that. But
it's funny because I made the exact note that you did. He's a dirtbag, says Phil Mushnick.
Yeah.
The Vince tries the WBF, the bodybuilding, federation, right in time to be accused of steroids. So that disappeared as quick as it came. And then we go into the Tommy Cole. The Phil Donahue clips were good. I've seen those before. I think you have as well, where he's just like, you were bad at your job. Like, ooh.
Well, and to hear Vince even sit there and say of, I'm confrontational, and have even other people, including himself, say that might have not gone so well. That really backfired.
Right. But then Vince turned around and sued Rita Marie, because the first lady ref that he was trying to promote, she accuses him of inappropriate behavior and forcing himself on her. But he went to the lengths of actually suing her for defamation. So that was kind of interesting.
Right. Well, and again, with most of this stuff, statute of limitations, and I'm just a small town bird lawyer and everything. It's to try and really open all of this up and everything. You would have had to have been there and all of that. So it will, and it's still controversy seems to constantly surround Vince. I will say that though,
and especially when it's a repeat pattern of behavior that he's accused of. And we'll talk about it more tonight as far as kind of what the lawyers said and such. They go from that, then they talk about the 3 indictments or the 3 counts of fraud on the steroid trial. Vince showing up with a neck brace, took an optional surgery right before. And who's the star witness for the prosecution? Terry Bollea. Go figure. And how did that work out for prosecution?
Well, and that's like I said, this is where I started to really think this is Belichick and this is Brady of forever linked. They might still argue over who made who and what have you, but they are forever linked. Hulk Hogan ain't gonna do no job, brother. Doesn't work for me, brother. And still goes full pivot. And I can't remember if did they end the episode with his testimony, or did they end it setting up his testimony?
What I think, what I have here is episode 2 ends with basically they come out of that, and that's when Hogan decides to go to WCW, and then they transition to episode 3.
Fair enough. Yeah, because I have WCW starts to become more of the competition and all of that, because this is the start of the steroid trial to where WCW starts to get on the rise because everybody's got to get off the juice, brother.
Well, I did find that very interesting of like Hogan had to go away. And Hogan's like, yeah, it was just a little stale and da-da-da. No, dude, You didn't. They had you on something. That's why you were going to testify. You took your plea and ran. Like, we got you.
Well, and that's when we get to when it was the Arsenio Hall show, to where Hogan's sitting there talking about, oh, I never took steroids. And I had a quote of this of, it was funny as hell to me to hear Vince sit there and say, tell the truth, it'd just be easier. Like, my guy, if there is anyone that that needs to heed that advice, it is you who said it. But to where Vince is out there of, just admit to doing steroids, it'd be easier than trying to fight it. Like, it's obvious at this point.
Right. Again, it's so funny. And then it's like, I didn't inhale. Like, dude, if you're going to half admit it and go all the way, I did it 3 times. Nah, now we know you're lying. Now we know you're full of shit. The last note I have for episode 2 that I was surprised with is Vince openly saying, like, Hulk joining WCW broke my heart. And that's not something Vince talks about a lot, is his heart.
That's again, they are forever tied. They were thick as thieves when it comes to all of this. They are 2 peas in a theoretical pod with all of this.
Mm-hmm. Episode 3 starts off with Wendy Richter, and I don't quite know why. I mean, I think they just did it to set the stage for the Montreal Screwjob.
So the first episode was labeled Junior, obviously, because of everything with my daddy. Episode 2 was labeled Heat. Makes sense with this is where you really kind of cause issues. And then episode 3 was labeled Screwjob. So to me, that made sense of you started off showing Vince is going to do whatever it takes. That was a big thing and a big discourse, I think, in this episode. Vince will put business over everything. Vince very much cares about this business. He will not disrespect this business. Do this business is treated a certain way. He was very much of still that mindset of this is the wrestling business and you protect the wrestling business above all else.
Yeah, and then the fact that Vince gets off from this, is not guilty for the steroid trial. Hogan saves his bacon. There was accusations of payoffs and potential jury tampering with, again, no evidence. Like this was a chance for me, like where Phil Mushnick could have like put forward, like, here's proof, or Meltzer, or any of the people that seem like they don't love Vince. What other than? But
again, then we're gonna get in a 27-part series and everything like that. A bit with that, and this is to me where you see a lot of people say Vince technically did nothing wrong. Like, he was not guilty in the sense of them going to trial and everything. But as much as they spun this of Vince being a good guy, Vince was not a good guy in this.
No.
We still clearly had a steroid issue. We still, clearly had issues amongst the business, amongst the roster, amongst the company.
Vince himself was juicing. We all knew that. He was jacked to the gills.
He thought he admitted it. That even I do it, so why would I be selling him and this and that? It was gonna like help him.
But he knew. That's his guilt. Is he knew as an employer what was happening. I do not believe that Vince was selling anybody anything. He had no reason to be a drug dealer.
Tony Atlas again, quote of the episode, comes in and says, "I was doing steroids before I met Vince."
Yeah. Tony Atlas, man.
Again, he's the MVP of this. Like, Brett's a number 2. Brett is silver medal, and then I'm trying to think of who might be like bronze right now. I still got 2 more episodes to figure out who's bronze, but Tony Atlas is the gold medal.
Well, and we'll talk about it tonight, but I thought Shane ends up coming out with like being a really good person in all this. Lex, they're getting to Lex trying to replace Hogan. WWE going into really rough times after the trial. They start the new generation. Brett as the face. Vince says Brett lacked charisma. Eric starts buying Vince's talent. Vince is all pissed off. Big bad, billionaire Ted screwing me. Meanwhile, he had just pillaged the entire territories.
Well, this is where that whole situation gets ironic, because they even asked Vince a couple of times of like, don't you feel what you were saying Ted did is basically just what you did? And he's like, no, it was different. He was trying to hurt the business. I was trying to help. How? but I'll put you out of business
Yeah.
because you're helping my business.
Yeah, I'm either going to buy out your talent and you're going to go broke, or you're going to sell me some talent and I'll cut a deal with you and you will go away. Like, I mean, that's the only difference was Ted didn't have enough flex on Vince to go, I'll buy your company. That was the only difference.
Well, this is where you really start to see Vince being that business forward and that cutthroat guy of,
yep.
I put the business above everything, of this is, I'm going to make sure, and paints the picture of, I'm just, self-made billionaire, while billionaire Ted with, the Nacho Man and the huckster are out there, cutting promos.
Yeah. I thought it was really funny that they covered the billionaire Ted skits, and I didn't actually realize that it was the lady from USA Network that phoned Vince and said, Ted's my buddy, can you stop?
Yeah, well, and I also hadn't seen the video footage of Turner actually watching it and just laughing of like, is that supposed to be Hogan? And like chuckling at it.
Oh my god. And Ted was very much like that. Like Ted loved his campy stuff and his silly movies. Like he was a Blazing Saddles type of guy. So it doesn't shock me that
he gets that you're going to take shots and everything. He had a good sense of humor.
To get into 83 weeks, we're not going to cover that. Everybody, if you don't know what 83
well, that's the thing, is this becomes like the Eric Bischoff promo section here of where he does his whole intro. 83 weeks, 83 weeks, 83 weeks.
Yeah. What I do still find funny is the egos between Eric and Vince, and there are some similarities there where neither one wants to kind of budge on certain things. Like, Vince McMahon was a copy of Eric Bischoff, and Vince is just like, come on, bro. Come on, like get out of here.
Yeah, but it does also even show that's a bit of what it takes to make it in pro wrestling, is you do have to have an ego. Like I really liked, and I know it's, again, this is wrestling history 101.
Yeah.
This is the Monday Night Wars explained to anyone that's never been initiated, that's not a super wrestling nerd and everything. So still fun to see it, still interesting to always hear it. But to where Eric Bischoff even explains of, how can I do everything that they're not doing? They're this, well, I'll be that. They're that, I'm going to be this. You land your plane over there, I'll land my plane over here.
Yeah, which was very true. And if you watch WCW prior to that whole NWO and Eric Bischoff, I mean, like Kevin Nash was the fucking wizard. Like, I mean,
he was Oz,
right? Like it was bad. I did make a note that was Bash at the Beach. Bash at the Beach has to be the greatest heel turn of all time. Like we don't get enough.
That's up there for arguably the greatest, one of the best moments in pro wrestling, because that was Captain America turning heel. That's like, if you almost could recreate it if John Cena was to ever go heel. I mean, you can't do it now with him retiring, but like to do it to where it's publicly at that much of a fever pitch. There's no internet, so you can't have spoilers. You can't have, according to Fightful Select, Hulk Hogan's the third member and what have you, to where you have nothing but like that visceral reaction of throwing trash in the ring and having a fan jump the barricade. Like that's never going to happen again in pro wrestling.
Scott Nash booted the shit out of that guy, which was infamous back in the day. If you jumped the rail, you were fair game, and the cops didn't care. There was no lawsuit. Like there was no. The world is so changed, and
the only modern example we've had of that is the one man that thought he could take on Jacob Fatu and found out the hard way. You don't challenge a werewolf.
No. And I mean, I think that, we look at the IWC nowadays where people are fucking bantering and threatening and getting all mad on their keyboards over nonsense about, whether a guy should have won or lost a match. And here we are, like, you look back at that and the wrestlers are legitimately in the ring nervous about people coming over.
Right. Well, and that's a missing thing in pro wrestling. I think it's interesting of, you still have to acknowledge that part of history and hope we can get back to that. And being of wrestling fans of a certain vintage, now that Triple H promo of, I'm going to go home and I'm going to tweet about it. And everything hits a little bit more home and everything of, you used to have fans that were willing to jump the barricade because they were so that emboldened. And now I'm not saying do that, because people act stupid once the second you try and say something like that. But that it was that people were that passionate about it, that
Yeah.
the spoilers weren't there, the dirt sheets
Yeah.
weren't as prevalent. You didn't
Mhm.
have at any moment you can know the results of any show. That
Mhm.
caught the world off guard.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think something that came apparent to me, again, the mindset of Triple H and understanding the business, understanding, and I think that's what we're seeing with him now is trying to elicit. There's a way to kayfabe can still live, and there's a way to play with it within the confines of a world that wants to know everything, but playing on the emotions of people, digging into the emotions of people, and everything about the reaction. We talk about it a lot. Like, it's great if you can jump through tables and do flips and tricks, but if you're not eliciting emotion, you're not telling a story. That's 90% of the business.
Well, that's also a big focus of what episode 3 was. Of they did it to where, you know, Luger wasn't eliciting the same emotion that Hogan was and everything like that. So they decided to pivot, and you sat there and turned around and had Luger show up after being on a house show on Sunday in WWE, show up on, you know, the debut episode of Monday Night Nitro in the Mall of America. So you instantly set the tone, set the feeling that WCW is the cool place to be.
Mhm. Yeah, and then they went into the screw job was kind of the wrapping up of episode 3, I believe, before they get into the Attitude Era. But the screw and they kind of touch on the Attitude Era going out. But again, we all know about the Montreal screw job that's been covered to death. We're not going to go too far into it. But
I still liked when they were, well, at least halfway with what they were talking about, of Hunter finally admitting, you know, I knew, and both him and Sean saying, no matter who asks you, bold-faced lie to them.
Yeah. Vince wanted the responsibility of that. Vince wanted to take it on the chin. And Vince was worried about the heat the boys were going to get. So he, to his credit, there's two things that Vince did. Again, people can, you know, have their opinions on Vince. We're not defending him. But to the man's credit, he went to ringside. And one of my favorite quotes of this episode was, yeah, he spit my face. I didn't know how he did it. Like, it was just like the perfect.
Amazed. Yeah, and when you have the type of match that I have, you get a foam in your mouth. Like, I think they were trying to find every other way outside of saying "hot to," is what that man did. But to sit there and show the reaction, and it was really cool, and it really tugged at you, especially, spoiler alert for later tonight and everything, with episode 4, to where Brett's talking about how Owen really calmed him down and was trying to play like the peacemaker with everything, of really bringing him back down, because Brett even says it's amazing how angry you can get when you feel like you've been embarrassed on, you know, national television.
Like you and I mean, everyone out there has had.
I still constantly to this day do the WCW taught and everything.
But people everywhere have embarrassing moments or go through a bad breakup, but we don't do it on live TV. Like, you know, you get fucked on live TV. I mean, and the other part of what Vince did with that whole situation is he took his lick. Like, he gave Brett one, and Brett landed hard. And they didn't get too far into that with this one.
Well, and so I will say real quick, I liked where they talked on Brett saying of like, I put 14 years into this, of I did whatever you asked. I missed Christmas days with my family and everything like that. How many front turnbuckle bumps and everything that I do. But yeah, Vince, I guess, allegedly decided he was going to get his lick back and everything, or let Brett get his lick back. But
and I mean, ultimately, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the story on how that happened was very. There was multiple sources and multiple iterations.
Yeah, and outside of this documentary, I mean, that's still highly contested. Because Triple H has said multiple times now, or a couple times now, that, you know, I was the one that kind of threw it out there, like, let's just fuck him, like, I don't care. Where like other people like Cornette was like, it was my thought, like I was the one that was like a part of, like,
just screw him, just fuck him. If he's not going to do business, then fuck him.
Right, Russo took, like, I mean, it's still
one of those. And Pritchard, of all people, to sit there and say, "I know nothing," like, really, you of all people.
Well, I mean, but they show that clip of Bruce standing up and being like, "What is going on?" And
yeah, but was that from then, or was that from another time? Because this was this was the Brett one, Shadows with Wrestling and everything. Like, that's the thing, is every episode of this documentary was like a mini movie, a season. You could have expounded on so much. But
yeah. But it was important to tell the Montreal Screwjob because it essentially, what the title of this documentary is and where it goes from there is Mr. McMahon. And without the Screwjob, we never get Mr. McMahon. So that's where we transition into episode 4.
Yeah, this is the birth of the Mr. McMahon character, and it's interesting. I'll say this as a tease for later on, kind of how the varying opinions of how much Mr. McMahon is Vince and how much Vince is Mr. McMahon is interesting. But I did want to ask you, speaking of lickbacks and everything, so do you believe Brett they charged at each other and he got the uppercut? Do you believe Vince he took the temple shot? We saw Vince with the shiner. The story I had always heard was Brett was, I'm going to go take a shower. If I come back out of the shower and you're still here, I'm punching you in the face.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
I don't believe, and I don't know, maybe I missed it, but I don't believe Vince lunged at him or any way, shape, or form. It was literally like, Vince was like, I had to do what I had to do. And Brett's like, me too.
Well, Brett sat there, and when they show the footage, he's like, he just stood there. I knocked him out and everything like that. And even Sean and Hunter even mentioned about how Vince felt like he at least owed it to Brett of like, I fucked you over, so take your shot and everything.
Yeah.
But then Brett said a whole shot of that. I don't know where they got he just let me hit him thing from. We lunged at each other and we locked up like we're wrestling, and I had a shot to just hit an uppercut. Meanwhile, he's got a shiner up here, my guy.
Yeah, no, he popped them one way or the other, and I mean, I think a couple, especially that Wrestling with Shadows showed the big black eye and Vince staring at the floor trying to shimmy through people. So, Brett Brett the Hate Man Hark. I mean, it's my favorite. I mean, I love this guy.
Salty. He is Salt Brett instead of Salt Bay.
But I mean, again, like you said, 14 years poured into the industry. He believed on a certain standard. And again, I mean, we could spend a whole episode debating whether or not Brett screwed Brett or Vince screwed Brett. At the end of the day, it was the Wild West. Medusa pops up, drops the women's title in the garbage. They weren't letting Brett do that. Not that I don't think Brett would have ever done it. And if he didn't have the personal gripe with Sean, it may have never came to that point, but it becomes one of the most pivotal moments in wrestling lore, in history.
Yeah, in wrestling history, and they touch on that of saying Brett didn't have a problem losing the belt. He had a problem losing the belt to me. Yeah. And that's the big part too of Vince didn't trust because of the Hogan situation, because of Nash and Hall. He didn't trust that Brett would do right by the business of that he's going to still technically be a WCW guy. We would have gotten like an ECW to where Taz takes the belt off of Mike Awesome and neither guy works for ECW situation. So this again shows where Vince, I put the business above all else.
I like this one. This way,
we could do that. We could do that. Captain Canada defends, Mr. Canada.
Yeah, we might have to put Anthony on the stand or on the bench for that one.
Right.
But that's it. I mean, we're going to cut it off here, folks. That is the first 3 episodes. Again, nothing overly groundbreaking. It was a really good, kind of history of where WWE started, where it got to, and now as we head into the back 3 tonight, we will be here live to kind of get into Mr. McMahon. Where does it go? What was some more of the salacious rumors and stories involving him? What was what was the evolution of it all? And we'll get more into that tonight. And then we'll also follow up with some of the other things that are going around the internet since it's come out. Very interesting thing, especially, Vince and Janelle both putting out a statement around this documentary. Vince's statement, now that I've watched this, seems unnecessary because I don't feel like
he tried to buy it back. He tried to buy it back.
Yeah. Wait, and when we get to the end, and we'll talk about it tonight, because they asked Bruce straight out, like, what do you think? Have you seen some of the episodes? And he's like, y'all suck. He's so bad. But Bruce loyal to the grave.
Well, 100%. And this is still, I think this is the good breaking point because this is the evolution, the birth of the Mr. McMahon character and everything. Of this is when, again, I kind of hinted at it of it comes into question, how much does art imitate life and everything, like we talked about before. Right. And this might be where they start to pivot from, this was just going to be a retelling of the history events, to, oh, other things are currently breaking. So now the thread that they've tied together starts to become unwoven.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, again, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the times that we're in opposed to the times that we used to be in, and da 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 da. But we will get into all of it tonight, folks. For those who showed up today or watching this recording, do not forget there's a part 2. We will be here live tonight. If you miss us tonight, it will be on our page forever. But Nick and I, and hopefully Anthony, hopefully T's and P's to our buddy Anthony, who's dealing with some weather. But hopefully all 3 of us are here tonight to break down episode 4, 5, and 6 and give our final thoughts on Mr. McMahon and the craziness that was his life and the insane, kind of look back at it all. But any final thoughts there, Nikki?
Tony Atlas is an MVP, and I want to be friends with Tony Atlas. Yeah, that's my final thought out of all of this.
Tony's a guy, and a good one. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Remember, tonight, tomorrow, we got more content than you can shake a stick at. And until then, we'll see you on the flip side. Bye for now.